few of them with the oil lines can be pumped across, and it's a completely different thing. But in those days, it all had to be done by hand. And so you had this crew, this large crew that did nothing, literally, shoveling coal into the system. It was and it was a very dangerous kind of thing, because you get a spark in the coal fuel, and the ship just can blow up. Now, the sister ship of the Jupiter was the Cyclops, and that's one of the world's great mysteries. Is it went to sea, left Boston Harbor, went to sea, was never heard of again.
Oh, really?
And so it undoubtedly had a spark, blew up, and it just disappeared. But it disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, so that's one of the added mysteries of the thing. And it was I had a friend who was a captain of a carrier, and I told him, I said, my uncle commanded the first U.S. aircraft carrier, and he was really surprised about that. And he said, I said, well, kind of. And then I told him the story about the Jupiter and the Langley, and he knew the history, and it was.
It's that. I'm just comparing pictures. Of course, I'm Googling it.
What's this one then?
And that's the Langley.
Oh,
that's the Jupiter without the.
It's funny because the proportions, because of the angles.
Yeah, but it's the same ship.
Yeah.
Same ship.
So this is what they turned it into.
Yeah.
That's what I'm looking at photos of that too.
There's some other of those photos, because that one's got like something got on it, but I think the ones I have at home are a little bit better shaped than that.
Yeah, because this one has like a bunch of planes on it. It's that one.
Yeah.
How does Terry have all the same photos that I do?
And it went down in 1942.
This thing?
The Battle of Java Sea. That was it. The Japanese outnumbered the fleet. The Langley was part of what was called the Asiatic Squadron in the U.S. Navy, and the largest ship was the USS Houston, which was the flagship. And the fleet got trapped in the Java Sea by the Japanese and was destroyed. There were very few survivors of it. And the ABD fleet, American, British, Dutch fleets, they never stood a chance.
Do you know who that is?
Oh, that's great-grandma Bridges.
How many greats is that?
I don't know. But that was, she was the sky end of the family. She had come across the plains, and everybody's got the same story. Somebody in the party was always kidnapped by the Indians and rescued, which may have happened or it may not have happened. I never knew, but supposedly she was kidnapped by the Indians, and then as a young girl, and then they paid ransom and got her off. But she came over. Now that the Bridges family that came through were stuck in it may have been St. Louis. I'm not sure of that though. But anyway, they had the routes into the west were pretty limited, and so you had options in St. Louis or any of these other key cities of moving, of joining, a caravan. In other words, you could put together a whole bunch of covered wagons, and the deal was you would buy into it from the standpoint that you would share food, you would share cooking, you would share other things, you would share protection, and all of this. So they were in a city, and I think it may have been St. Louis, and the choice was to go into the Oregon Trail, which was one of the major routes, and then there was a Mormon trail, and then there was the trail, and I forgot some of that history. But anyway, one of the parties that was being organized was the Donner Party, and they were considering going with the Donner Party. But the Donner Party had a lot of problems. They were, yeah, and
even early on.
They invited some cannibals.
And what happened is that they got a late start, and the late start brought them into the Rockies just during the snow. The snow season was early. They were late, and it was a recipe for disaster. Well, anyway, they didn't do that. They went on the Oregon Trail and settled in Oregon before moving down south into California. The my mother, was born in Oregon, and she was the last of the Bridges family that were in Oregon. The rest of them had already begun to move down into Southern California. But she was we go over, and they were must visits. And I would always, my duty was, as a dutiful nephew, is to pay my respects to her for the family. And she would talk. She was very, very religious. Seventh-day Adventist. And she would always give me a book about religion, and which I never read. But she also gave me she gave me some history books, which I did read. She lived almost to 100. I think she was just shy of 100.
Oh, really?
And it was, but she saw a lot of history. They moved down, they bought property for the Banning family in Wilmington, Banning Park. Well, it used to be a big estate, and they bought land just on the periphery. Nice home. It was a nice home even then, right across from Banning High School. She used to walk through the park, and she said to some of the relatives, is that I smell oil here. And if they'd paid attention, the family would have been wealthy beyond their means, because there was oil there. And they're still pumping it.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, she's a grand old lady.
You have to pass those down. I feel like Stacia wants to know the green machine.
I know.
It'd be easier.
I don't know if that says who that
couldn't
is
afford it.
either.
Yeah. Well,
That one doesn't look
$3
familiar.
page. She must have been 100 here. No.
That looks like it might be Dad's great-grandfather. That could be Bradford Jones, because he's bearing a medal, and he fought with the Union Army in the Civil War. And with the Pennsylvania Regiment. Maryland was a border state, and it was very, very reluctant to raise troops for either the Union or the Confederacy. And so what happened is that whatever your disposition was, you would go to Pennsylvania and join the Union Army, one of the regiments, or some of the regiments there, or go to the Confederacy and join Lee's Army, the Northern Virginia. And he served in one of the Pennsylvania divisions. And it was, now Bradford Jones, Jones is an interesting name in its derivation because it comes from, it can be Irish and it can be Welsh. In this particular case, it was Welsh.
I remember a long time ago that.
Yeah, and he, the Jones family was very, very close, and I think there was some intermarriage along the way of family, but when it would have been I was about 8 or 9 years old, so it would have been 1938 or 39, probably 39, that one of the Jones boys that had a real close relationship with Dad. Dad was kind of a surrogate brother to him, and he was Edward Allen Jones, and he had joined the Marine Corps. And now can you imagine, I was 8 or 9, and when he came to the house dressed in his uniform, I mean, that was something. That was the only person that you ever saw in a uniform, and it was really, really something. And Edward was a real hero to me. He always used to send me postcards from everywhere he went. He was stationed on the USS Augusta, which was a historic Navy cruiser. That's where Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, on the deck of the Augusta in Newfoundland, signed the Atlantic Charter. And anyway, Edward was, we always looked forward, and he, anytime he was in Long Beach, which was a major Navy port in those days, he would come to the house, and he was. Then when the war broke out, we didn't hear very much from him. We got a couple of old Gmail letters, and I'm sure Mother kept them.
There's an album full of all kinds of like letters and cards and.
Could be.
Yeah.
And so he wrote, not very often, and we didn't know where he was. You know, security was very tight in those days, and mail was censored both going and coming. And he was, he had been at Guadalcanal, and then he had been at Bougainville, and so many of the officers were lost in those battles that he was promoted to a first lieutenant, and he was head of a machine gun unit, and he went to towards the end of the war, the 5th Marine Regiment